Every empire in history has followed the exact same seven-stage collapse pattern. Rome, Britain, Spain, the Ottoman Empire. And right now, the United States has just entered stage 6, the most dangerous phase where collapse accelerates exponentially. This isn't opinion, this is historical fact, backed by 2,000 years of data. And what I'm about to show you should terrify every American, because once you understand this pattern, you'll see why the next 5 years will determine whether America survives or joins the graveyard of fallen empires. I'm going to walk you through each stage, show you exactly where we are, and reveal the hidden forces that are pushing us toward the point of no return. Because here's what they don't want you to know. Stage 6 is where empires either pull back from the brink or collapse completely, and all the signs suggest that we're accelerating toward the latter. Let me start with a number that should keep you awake at night. $34.7 trillion. That's America's national debt. But here's the part that makes it truly terrifying. It's growing by $1 trillion every 100 days. Every single day. We add $8.5 billion to that debt. To put this in perspective, when Rome fell in 476 AD, their debt-to-GDP ratio was 25%. When the British Empire peaked and began its decline after World War I, their debt-to-GDP ratio hit 180%. Today, America's debt-to-GDP ratio is 129% and climbing fast. But debt is just one indicator. The real pattern runs much deeper. You see, empires don't collapse overnight. They follow a predictable 7-stage cycle that historians have documented across millennia. And here's what should terrify you. Every single stage has specific warning signs, specific tipping points, and specific time frames. Stage 1 through 3 build the empire. Stage 4 marks the peak. Stage 5 begins the decline. Stage 6 is where collapse accelerates. And Stage 7 is the final fall. The United States dominated Stage 1 through 4 from 1776 to roughly 2000. We've been in Stage 5, the decline phase, since 2001, and the evidence suggests we entered Stage 6 in 2020. Here's why that matters. Historically, empires spend 200 to 300 years in Stages 1 to 4, 50 to 100 years in Stage 5, but only 10 to 20 years in Stage 6 before reaching Stage 7. Complete collapse. If we entered Stage 6 in 2020, that gives us until 2030 to 2040 before we reach the point of no return. The 7-stage empire collapse pattern. Stage 1, foundation and expansion, 1776 to 1850. Every empire starts the same way. A hungry, disciplined population with strong values builds something from nothing. For America, this was the Revolutionary War through westward expansion. The key characteristics: minimal debt, strong work ethic, clear moral framework, and rapid territorial growth. America checked every box. Stage 2, commercial dominance, 1850 to 1914. This is where empires become economic powerhouses. America's Industrial Revolution, railroad expansion, and emergence as a global trading power. We went from a farming nation to an industrial giant in 60 years. The warning sign that appears in Stage 2, the first taste of easy money. For America, this was the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the moment we started borrowing against our future. Stage 3, military supremacy, 1940 to 1945. Every empire reaches a point where their economic power translates to military dominance. 2 world wars established America as the global superpower. We had the strongest military, the strongest economy, and the world's reserve currency. This is the stage where empires feel invincible, and that feeling of invincibility plants the seeds of their destruction. Stage 4, peak prosperity, 1945 to 2000. This is the golden age. Post-Wotu America was the undisputed global hegemon. We had 50% of global GDP, the strongest military, the dollar was backed by gold, and American culture dominated the world. But here's where the pattern gets dangerous. Peak prosperity creates 3 fatal problems. First, the population becomes soft. When life is easy, People lose the hunger that built the empire. Second, the government becomes bloated. Success breeds bureaucracy, and bureaucracy breeds inefficiency. Third, the empire overextends. Success makes leaders believe they can solve every problem with money and military force. All three happened to America between 1945 and 2000. Stage 5, financial overextension, 2000 to 2020. This is where empires begin borrowing against their future to maintain their lifestyle. For America, this started with the dot-com bubble, accelerated after 9/11, and exploded during the 2008 financial crisis. The key indicators of Stage 5: debt grows faster than the economy. Military spending becomes unsustainable. Currency debasement begins. Wealth inequality explodes. Political polarization increases. Sound familiar? From 2000 to 2020, America's debt went from $5.6 trillion to $27 trillion. Military spending went from $300 billion to $800 billion. The wealth gap reached levels not seen since 1929. But Stage 5 is still recoverable. Empires can pull back, cut spending, and reset. The problem is, they rarely do. Stage 6, currency crisis and social unrest, 2020 to present. This is where we are now. And this is where empires either save themselves or accelerate toward collapse. Stage 6 has 5 unmistakable characteristics, and America is showing all 5. First, currency debasement accelerates. Since 2020, the Federal Reserve has printed more money than in the previous 100 years combined. $4.5 trillion created out of thin air. The dollar has lost 20% of its purchasing power in just 4 years. Second, social cohesion breaks down. Political polarization reaches extreme levels. Trust in institutions collapses. Civil unrest becomes common. Look around. Does this sound familiar? Third, military overextension becomes obvious. The empire can no longer afford its global commitments, but refuses to pull back. America currently has 800 military bases in 80 countries, costing $150 billion annually, while our infrastructure crumbles at home. Fourth, rival powers emerge. China's economy has grown from $1 trillion in 2000 to $18 trillion today. The BRICS nations are actively working to replace the dollar as the global reserve currency. Russia and China are building alternative financial systems. Fifth, the empire doubles down instead of pulling back. This is the fatal mistake every empire makes in Stage 6. Instead of cutting spending and reforming, they print more money, start more wars, and increase government control. America is doing all 3 right now. Hidden forces accelerating the collapse. Here's what they don't want you to understand. Stage 6 collapse isn't driven by external enemies. It's driven by internal contradictions that become impossible to manage. The debt-death spiral. America now pays over $1 trillion annually just in interest on our debt. That's more than we spend on defense. And here's the terrifying part. As interest rates rise, that number explodes. If rates go to 6%, still below historical averages, our annual interest payments would hit $2 trillion. That's 40% of all government revenue just to service debt, not to fund anything. This creates what economists call a debt-death spiral. You have to borrow money to pay the interest on money you already borrowed. It's mathematically impossible to escape without either massive cuts or currency collapse. The reserve currency trap. Since 1944, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency. This gave America an incredible advantage. We could print money and export our inflation to other countries. But that advantage is disappearing. China and Russia are trading in their own currencies. Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil. The BRICS nations are building a gold-backed alternative to the dollar. When the dollar loses reserve currency status, and it will, America will face the same inflation and currency crisis that destroyed every other empire in Stage 6. The demographic collapse. Here's a number that should terrify every American. Our birth rate is 1.7 children per woman. You need 2.1 just to maintain population. We're literally disappearing as a people. But it gets worse. The baby boomers, our largest generation, are retiring. In 1960, there were 5 workers for every retiree. Today, it's 3 workers per retiree. By 2030, it'll be 2 workers per retiree. This creates an impossible math problem. Fewer workers supporting more retirees, while the government promises benefits it can't afford. Every empire in Stage 6 faces this same demographic crisis, and every empire that fails to solve it collapses. Historical parallels. Let me show you how this exact pattern destroyed 3 previous empires, because the parallels to modern America are terrifying. Rome, 27 B.C. to 476 A.D. Rome entered Stage 6 around 235 A.D. with the crisis of the 3rd century. Sound familiar to our current crisis? They debased their currency. The silver content of Roman coins went from 90% to 5% in 50 years. Inflation exploded. Social unrest became constant. The military became too expensive to maintain. Rome's response? They doubled down. More spending, more currency debasement, more military campaigns. They refused to accept that the empire had grown too large to manage. The result? Complete collapse in 476 A.D. Spain, 1492 to 1898. Spain dominated the world for 300 years through gold and silver from the Americas. But easy money made them lazy and overconfident. They entered Stage 6 around 1640, when their debt crisis became unmanageable. Their response? Print more money, start more wars, and refuse to reform. By 1898, Spain had lost its entire empire and become a second-rate power. Britain, 1583 to 1997. Britain built the largest empire in human history. At its peak, they controlled 25% of global landmass and 25% of global population. They entered Stage 6 after World War I, when their debt-to-GDP ratio hit 180%. The pound lost its status as the global reserve currency. Social unrest exploded. Britain's advantage was they recognized the crisis and managed their decline. They gave up their empire gradually instead of fighting to maintain it. This allowed them to survive as a smaller but stable nation. The question is, will America follow Britain's example of managed decline, or Rome and Spain's example of catastrophic collapse? Why Stage 6 is the most dangerous. Here's what makes Stage 6 so dangerous. It's where empires face their final choice: pull back and survive as a smaller power, or double down and face complete collapse. The problem is, pulling back requires admitting weakness, and empires in Stage 6 are psychologically incapable of admitting weakness. This creates what historians call imperial overstretch syndrome. The empire knows it's in trouble, but instead of cutting back, it becomes more aggressive, more controlling, and more desperate to maintain its dominance. Look at America's behavior since 2020. Massive money printing to maintain living standards, increased military aggression toward China and Russia, attempts to control global financial systems through sanctions, domestic authoritarianism to maintain social control. This is textbook Stage 6 behavior, and it always ends the same way: the acceleration factor. Here's the most terrifying part about Stage 6. Collapse accelerates exponentially. What takes decades in Stage 5 happens in years during Stage 6. Why? Because Stage 6 is where all the empire's contradictions reach critical mass simultaneously. Debt becomes mathematically impossible to service. Currency loses international confidence. Military becomes too expensive to maintain. Social cohesion completely breaks down. Rival powers sense weakness and become aggressive. When these 5 factors converge, collapse becomes inevitable and rapid. The point of no return. So, when does Stage 6 become irreversible? Historical analysis shows 3 specific tipping points. Tipping point 1. Debt to GDP exceeds 150%. America is at 129% and rising fast. At current trajectory, we'll hit 150% by 2028. Tipping point 2. Interest payments exceed 25% of government revenue. We're currently at 15% and rising. If interest rates normalize, we'll hit 25% within 3 years. Tipping point 3. Reserve currency status is formally challenged. This is already happening. The BRICS nations are actively building dollar alternatives. When all three tipping points are reached, Stage 7, complete collapse, becomes inevitable. Based on current trends, America will reach all three tipping points between 2027 and 2030. What happens next? If America follows the historical pattern, here's what the next 5 to 10 years will look like. 2025 to 2027. The crisis deepens. Inflation returns with a vengeance. Social unrest becomes constant. Political system becomes increasingly authoritarian. International challenges to dollar dominance accelerate. 2027 to 2030. The breaking point. Debt crisis becomes unmanageable. Currency crisis begins. Military overextension becomes obvious. Social cohesion completely breaks down. 2030 to 2035. Stage 7, the collapse. Federal government loses control. States begin asserting independence. Dollar loses reserve currency status. America fragments into regional powers. This isn't inevitable, but it's the most likely outcome based on 2,000 years of historical precedent. Closing. The United States is following the exact same 7-stage collapse pattern that has destroyed every empire in history. We've entered Stage 6, the most dangerous phase where collapse accelerates exponentially. The next 5 years will determine whether America pulls back from the brink like Britain or collapses completely like Rome and Spain. The signs are not encouraging. Instead of recognizing our limitations and managing decline, we're doubling down on the same policies that created the crisis. But here's what you need to understand. This pattern is bigger than any individual politician or policy. It's the natural life cycle of empires, and once Stage 6 begins, it's almost impossible to stop. The question isn't whether America will decline. That's already happening. The question is whether we'll manage that decline intelligently or let it destroy us completely. History suggests the latter is more likely. But understanding this pattern gives you the knowledge to protect yourself and your family from what's coming. Because while empires rise and fall, prepared individuals can survive and thrive through any transition. The collapse isn't coming, it's already here. The only question is whether you'll see it coming in time to prepare.